Check this out.
Yeah, there it is.
Crazy.
Yeah, that's it. That's the cartouche in the relieving chamber, and that is the sole piece of written evidence which Egyptologists rely on to attribute the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, to Khufu. This is one of the ways in which the Giza pyramids.
Okay, so am I going to go back down the Egypt Graham Hancock rabbit hole? I'm a Graham Hancock fan, but not everything in that vein of thinking strikes me as particularly convincing. How did I get on the subject matter again? Well, as you can see, I'm in my bedroom and work a physical job, so I was in limbo, laying there trying to recover, and towards that end, I have YouTube playing in the background because my mind wants to kind of explore, meander around, while my body is basically a block of wood. There's a guy called Coach Colin on YouTube. I see that he's posted a video about Zahi Hawass and him being on Joe Rogan. And right there it says, this guy is the worst, referring to Zahi Hawass. Now, Zahi Hawass had a famous falling out with Hancock, and there's some rumor that that's why Hancock is banned. I wasn't really able to find anything official about that, though I'm sure that seeing how influential Hawass is, it might make it difficult for Hancock to do some of the things that he wants to do, and I don't think that's cool. But at the same time, Hawass being a bit of an ordinary older man is not a reason to engage with every crazy theory. So during this video, what particularly caught my ire as being comment-worthy enough to share here, at least in brief for the time being, and hopefully, time permitting, doing a follow-up, is that Graham mentioned something about Vyse, which I thought was Vyse like Jewish Vyse, not Vyse like English Vyse, V-Y-S-E. But anyway, he mentioned this guy, and he's a British Egyptologist back in the 1800s, and apparently in order to, get himself out of financial trouble, he had to make a discovery, and he was this slapdash guy who just blasted his way into the pyramid, and then forged this cartouche of Khufu, and that's the only thing that Egyptologists have used to link the building of that pyramid to Khufu. So I did lazy basic bit research and plugged that in to Google, and of course I came up with Reddit, but the answer I got on there was satisfactory enough for my purposes initially here to kind of go, yeah, that's making some sense. So the question being asked is, how likely is it that Colonel Howard Vyse forged the Khufu inscription in the Great Pyramid? And this guy named Mike Dash, who is kind of a top Redditor, I'm sure that's not a coveted position, but he is. I'll have to look into his credentials other than that later on, says not remotely likely. The idea that the marks were forgeries was suggested by Zachariah Sitchin, another favorite person of mine, in his pseudoscientific The Stairway to Heaven, 1980, a book proposing that the pyramids were built by ancient astronauts, and it has recently been reiterated by Scott Creighton in The Great Pyramid Hoax, 2016. But to be able to forge the quarry marks that Vyse discovered in the chambers he forced open above the king's chamber, he would have to be able to read and write in hieroglyphics with a high degree of fluency, which he wasn't. The marks he found were carefully copied and sent back to the British Museum, where an Egyptologist named Samuel Birch actually made the translations. Creighton actually concedes this point and admits that Sitchin's evidence was eventually discredited. As a result, his controversial allegation was soon dismissed, and many of those who had hitherto supported him quickly distanced themselves from the controversy. And then it goes on to say that this whole reliance on Khufu, that one inscription, that one cartouche, is misplaced because later on there were other inscriptions found using the same kind of clay that was indistinguishable and was in hard places to forge. And it had different names. So, like, apparently these pharaohs would have 5 names associated with them and with the work gangs that were kind of, what these cartouches were about, etc. So that's how they linked it in multiple ways to this Khufu guy via that. It wasn't just this one cartouche of Khufu that big archaeology, is using to prove this point. And Graham Hancock, at least in the video as far as I watched it, says, oh, that's the only bit of evidence. Well, clearly it's not. So that's the kind of little bits and pieces here and there that make me go, yeah, Graham Hancock has some interesting points, but he also has his biases, which means that he's going to miss the mark sometimes. Like, did he necessarily miss it here based on what I found out in this Reddit post? I would love to see Graham Hancock give a follow-up. And, I could read this whole wall of text. Maybe I will. Let me come back to you. But basically, that the stuff that's in here, I need to hear addressed. Because if that clip of Hancock saying that Khufu was only linked to that particular Great Pyramid or whatever it was that was in question because of that inscription, well, that's blatantly wrong. And he's this big media figure. So I don't think that he would be that blatantly wrong. So I would love to hear from Graham Hancock fans. Clearly, Graham Hancock probably is not going to respond to this, but somebody explain to me how that happens besides Graham Hancock just being kind of biased and, in this instance, getting something spectacularly wrong. All right. Anyway, I'll be back here in a second.
Hey there, everybody. So I'm back, and I was not able to find through my quick Google searches any kind of Graham Hancock elaborating on rebuttals to, the claim that he made that Howard Vyse forged the cartouche and that cartouche is the only link that we have to Khufu of the Great Pyramid. If it's there, please let me know. But I'm going to go ahead and lay out these little brief bullet points that I took notes of from that guy's Reddit post, which he actually got his source information from Howard Vyse's own kind of 3-volume work on what he did at Giza in 1837. It's called Howard Vyse Operations Carried On at the Pyramids of Giza in 1837. 3 volumes, Cambridge, 2015 publication. And then Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass, Giza and the Pyramids, 2017. So that's the source this guy got this stuff from. And here's a little bit of more of an elaboration of what he said that I'm going to give you instead of just reading through that big wall of text, which you should go and check out. I'll link it down below. Here we go. So the pharaohs, they took 5 different names, regnal names, big royal titles. And they were not known during Vyse's time. And yet they appear in the graffiti that was found at the pyramid. So that's, linking it to Khufu. All right. So also Vyse was not really well versed in hieroglyphic writing. I think he actually had an expert he was communicating with. And I think even that expert would not have been, because this was an emerging field of study at the time, at least from what I gathered. And definitely not as developed as it is in the present. Now, again, if he forged these marks, several of them were found that were partially obscured. And they were painted onto blocks that were lifted and fitted into place with other blocks over the top of them. So that would have been quite the operation. Again, being in the 1800s and far away from England and stuff, he would have had plenty of time to do that. But did he? And also using that red ochre specific kind of dye and taking all of those details into account, details that as a guy working in an emerging field back in the 1800s would have been really difficult to be privy to. And again, if he was trying to use these marks to impress somebody to get more funding because he was in financial trouble, that's not really what would have gotten him the funding. Because as you can imagine, especially like even if you think about like popular conceptions of like grave robbers and looters and what patrons would pay for, archaeology, as Danny the Dunker says, is kind of like a collector's activity where people are looking for stuff that's cool. And that's how it started. Well, this was kind of at the inception of that very period of that kind of activity, the heyday of it. So artifacts and chambers would have been more of what was being looked for. It wouldn't really have been this like lone cartouche. And again, if these marks are what like made his name, Vyse's name, why would he have barely mentioned it in his own work that I cited there at the beginning? The Howard Vyse operations carried on at the pyramids of Giza in 1837. You could say, well, he was ashamed that he had forged it and didn't want to remind people of it. But then I would say, but, if that's how he would have gotten his funding, then he probably would have mentioned it, right? Especially if at the time he didn't feel that he would have been found out. Anyway, just all sorts of speculation going on there. And, recently I was watching a Joe Rogan clip from when Zawi was just on, which is kind of actually what sparked this whole thing of videos, as I'm now realizing, because that one video clip that I got from Coach Colin was actually about Zawi's recent appearance. I didn't know that just happened, and I just watched pretty much all of the Zawi appearance. But during that, Rogan is kind of looking, all Rogan-y, like, hey, you're trying to bamboozle me here, fella, at Zawi Hawass. And he's talking about bias and how scientists can be biased. This is about that kind of like whatever laser thing technique that those two Italian guys used to look under the pyramid recently, that whole spectacle. So yeah, Joe, people can get biased. Scientists can get biased. We shouldn't just take their word for it. They're wrong a lot of the time, as you say. But then again, why doesn't that apply to the scientists you're positing? And, these guys, Sitchin and Creighton, that probably Graham Hancock, when he made his statement, got this idea about Vyse being a forger from. Well, they didn't start with, this kind of like debunking of Vyse and clear reasons to presume that he was a faker. No, they started with the proposition that traditional Egyptology is wrong and wanted to prove a point, and then went in looking for evidence and didn't provide very good evidence, as we've seen here, of why Vyse was the forger. So if anybody has any thoughts on this, like, I'm completely open-minded. Again, I'm a big alt archaeology fan. I just want the woo to be actual, like, woo. Like, if we're gonna be fascinated by these things, as we rightly should be, then wouldn't it be great if we actually arrived at the correct conclusion, which might take some doing? And even if in this particular instance there's not that much mystery there, well, there's going to be mystery elsewhere. And the only way we're going to figure out what it is that's so cool about being humans and knowledge we might have lost is by being thorough. And that's the point of this video. But towards that end, go crazy in the comments below. Feel free to roast me. I'm not particularly sensitive. And I just want my luminaries like Graham Hancock to be a little bit more on the ball with these criticisms that they're making. All right. See you guys later, because I got to go make some friggin' eggs and get into my work clothes. Peace. Oh, hi. Yeah, I thought the video was over too, but no. Because that's kind of what happens when you're dealing with these information-dense topics. You find something, and then you got to make an addendum. I'm not going to remake the entire video because the premise of it stands that Graham Hancock has not really presented a rebuttal to the rebuttal to the claims that Vyse made that forgery. The appearance that I cited at the beginning of this video, where he was on the Patrick Bat David podcast, and he was talking about the Great Pyramid and how that cartouche is the only written thing linking that Great Pyramid to Khufu. That's very recent, and I haven't been able to see anything by Graham himself further elaborating on the topic. However, on his website, grahamhancock.com/Creightons12/, there's an article by Scott Creighton, who's one of the guys that was critiqued by that Reddit guy I was just talking about. And he gives this kind of like multi-paragraph little essay treatise on some of the points that were just made against the Vyse thing being a forgery. So go and check that out. I'm going to do a more detailed breakdown of what I think about this in an upcoming video, but I thought it was important to point out that there was elaboration. I just haven't seen it come from Hancock, and I think that because this is one of those topics where like people are gonna get interested, like me. Like I heard Graham make the statement. I went, that sounds interesting. I did a bit of digging. Boom, I got that rebuttal, and that rebuttal made sense. And then it came to this, and Graham is the popularizer of these things, so I think I should have been able to more readily find video clips of Graham talking about it, or articles by Graham talking about it, but, typing, Graham, Vyse, Khufu, Graham Hancock, Vyse, Khufu, forgery thing into Google, or any combination of those things, really only yielded this after some digging, this article by Scott Creighton, the guy that wrote The Great Pyramid Hoax. So, and this was published in 2024. Anyway, stuff was emerging about this that some of what Scott Creighton thinks supports his viewpoints, and other people are seeing other stuff emerge that supports their viewpoints. Like when Hawass was on, part of what he was talking about was that boat thing in the Sinai with the papyri that had, was talking about how Khufu's stuff was being transported there, and that linked the Great Pyramid to it. So, yeah, sorry about that sloppy explanation, but I'm trying to go super quick and give you a brief kind of natural flow explanation. But anyway, just comment on what you guys think below, and I'll keep you posted. Thanks. Bye.